Grave diggers, corpse grinders, skull takers. Every unit that shared his profession had a name like that. As Corporal Brandy floated silently, his body suspended in a dense salt-water-based solution alongside 11 of his peers, he once again thought how he liked the name of his unit the best. Ghouls. His arms were stretched out, as were his legs, secured to the four corners of the hull, leaving him splayed open. His wrists were tethered, his ankles were tethered, all to keep him from drifting. The water was cold, felt even through the suit, though it didn't touch him. It was only appropriate they called vessels like the one he was in coffins. It was long, with 7 feet between floor and ceiling when one could stand in it. The patch of his unit was a zombified corpse, walking towards the one viewing it, with an arm outstretched and a large 17 behind the shambling figure. It was laser-etched on the left shoulder guard of his SVS-51 bodysuit, the symbol of the Terran front also laser-etched on the right. Right now, Brandy knew he was flying through the void, heading towards the wreck of a Vral light cruiser, his unit's specialty. A countdown on the upper left corner of his vision was reaching the single digits. No one talked, not even the squad leader, not even command. Brandy liked it like that. He had been selected for special operations early on in his life, as most operators were. Sure, you could volunteer to join if you were already in the fleet and decided to test yourself, but most humans were training for something like this by the age of 13. Jessup, one of his squad mates, was a joiner, one who had volunteered when he signed up. Brandy, though. Brandy was a lifer. Lifers like him were singled out in school and made aware of their tentative selection. Lifers were trained harder, tested harder. No one really minded Jessup not going through what they had been through, but it did mark him out, hence the term. But lifers and joiners all got the same specialized training. 5 seconds left. Brandy knew his job well, knew the layout of the ship well. 4 seconds. Brandy clenched his fists. He felt the liquid shift, knowing their craft had hit the hull. Suddenly he was free of his constraints, floating free in the dense salt water. There was a bright light from the front of the craft, the plasma torches already burning into the raw light cruiser hull. 3 seconds. The dense salt water solution was suddenly sucked into the floor, drawing him down. He tapped his heels together, hearing an automated voice call out, "Maglocks engaged," just before his feet touched the deck. He was already yanking the protective cover off his rifle, slinging it back over his back. 2 seconds. Those in the front of the line had their rifles up and ready. Brandy, on the other hand, reached to his sides and drew out 2 long blades from sheaths locked to his thighs. 1. He felt the compression in his chest as the breaching charge detonated, and the segmented doors of the coffin opened. The first 4 ghouls entered, no shots fired as they cleared the room. He heard a soft whisper saying, "Depressurized." The entire deck was without atmosphere. Brandy looked to his left and nodded once. Jessup nodded back. The pair in front of them sprinted out. Jessup and Brandy sprinted out immediately after them, Brandy drawing his blades. The interior of the Vral ship was a dismal place, and within just seconds Brandy knew what kept their grav plates powered was already down. The difference in design priorities from the Vral to the Terran front could be seen even from the hallway they were running down. The Terran front fleet was designed to maximize the space they had, to deliver the most punch possible for the weight class the ship in question could hit with. The Chua had lent their practicality to that level of ship design. It was why the standard Terran corvette could fight completely out of its weight class. Brandy knew that the standard Terran corvette was more than a match for any variety of Vral destroyer. It was even said that a light cruiser would have to go blow for blow with one. Most who heard that wouldn't understand until they saw what Brandy was seeing now. Terran hallways were built narrow, the space an artery for personnel to move through in a very direct way. The ceilings would be laced with piping and joists, covered by protective layers of material just in case an impact threw the crew against the ceiling. Standing shoulder to shoulder, even battleship halls on Terran ships only allowed 2 large humans to stand shoulder to shoulder and extend their elbows halfway to touch the walls. This hallway was broad, 5 times the width. You would never see such a waste of space on board a Terran fighting ship. The only exceptions to this were the larger logistics ships, the carriers, and the Antares herself. Terran ship tonnage was dedicated purely to what the ship in question was made to do. Vral ships, on the other hand, seemed to be built not just to fight space conflicts, but to carry troops for ground assault. The Vral sacrificed tonnage meant for fighting for transport. They did not have dedicated troop ships or even dedicated logistic ships. Brandy guessed it made sense when you never had to worry about someone being able to really hit back. The map of the light cruiser was laid out in wireframe in the upper right of his HUD, a pulsing arrow pointing his way. As they reached the first door, it was clear that whatever powered the lights also powered the doors in this section. He sheathed the blades and raised his rifle as Jessup pulled his breech bar. A moment later, Jessup applied the handheld pneumatic and nodded once to Brandy, who gave an almost imperceptible nod back. Jessup pressed an activation stud, and Brandy breathed out as the door began to open. A brief glimpse of chitin was all it took for Brandy to immediately put 2 shells through the door, the only audible evidence of the shots being 2 ticks from the recoil traveling along his armor plate. "Contact," Brandy whispered, even as the shells tore through the Vral floating behind the door. The Vral flew away from the impact as the door opened further, revealing more Vral, all floating, all already dead. "KIA Vral," he whispered into the mic within his helmet. A small tone let him know his information was received. Brandy and Jessup moved into the hallway and saw why the Vral were all already dead. There was a gash in the hull almost 3 meters long and a meter wide. The deck had been exposed to the vacuum, and judging by the hole further down the hall, which Brandy glanced through as they passed, a railgun round from a cruiser had lanced straight through the entire hull. Brandy slung his rifle and began the halting half-run, half-jog of moving quickly on magnetized boots. Brandy cleared an adjoining hallway before looking back to the door. The Vral dead were everywhere, floating in the vacuum, and Brandy kept having to shove the floating corpses aside as he moved. The dead didn't stop him. They didn't stop Jessup either. Jessup was already setting the breacher, and Brandy's rifle was unslung and ready. As this door opened, a force field came to life in front of it, and a sliver of light began to show through. Brandy's thumb flipped his rifle from semi-automatic to full. He didn't need to speak. Jessup was already pulling his own rifle. As the door was suddenly shoved open by the pneumatic, Brandy's entire body snapped forward. The Vral that was standing by the door, who had even watched it open, made it clear that the Vral didn't even know they had been boarded. Brandy's rifle butt slammed into the head of the Vral, and sound returned as he moved fully through the force field meant to keep atmospheric integrity but not to keep him out. Beyond it, Brandy saw at least 20 milling around, a damage control team. The Vral turned to the sound of one of their own skulls caving in, chitin cracking, just to see Brandy's barrel come down. He was already moving left to give Jessup room to enter as he squeezed the trigger. Chitin and ichor erupted. The Vral leapt at the sound, some freezing in place, some charging. Jessup came around the corner, raising his rifle, taking single shots at individual Vral who reached for weapons even as Brandy's fully automatic spray swept the hall. Brandy was the scythe. Jessup was the surgeon. Brandy's ammo counter quickly cycled down, but he hadn't been simply praying and spraying. As his counter read 0, the last of the Vral was spasming violently on the floor. He thumbed the magazine release, the hand on his grip already having reached for his right hip to draw up a fresh magazine even as the empty one slid out and began falling to the floor. "I'm close," he said. He slammed the new magazine into the rifle, racked the slide, then slid it behind his back. He drew his blades, then began to sprint. "I'm far." Jessup began sprinting behind him. The next set of doors opened automatically this time to a familiar scene, but the Vral were already aware of them due to Brandy having firmly announced their presence in the previous hall. Brandy never stopped his full sprint, carving through the Vral with the edges of his monomolecular blades. Every so often a shot rang out, taking down one of the Vral just out of Brandy's reach or one that was pulling up a weapon. Brandy used the suit's speed and strength enhancements to their fullest, barely slowing as he tore through the group, both blades cutting. Suddenly he heard the retort of full auto and spun to decapitate one of the remaining Vral to see Jessup emptying his magazine into an open door. Brandy let both blades drop, popping his hip to the side and curling his waist, letting the weight of his rifle carry it around his body into his hands. As the Vral tried to come into the hall, they were cut down, caught in a fatal funnel of fire by their own hatchway. "Reload," Jessup said, tucking himself back against the wall. "Control, need sweepers, my location." A tone was the only reply to Jessup's words. 12 men, organized into 6 teams. That was the boarding party. Each had a part to play, and as Jessup made the call for sweepers, Brandy was already preparing to move. As Jessup slapped a fresh magazine into his rifle, Brandy was still covering the door. The other doors in the hall remained closed. Jessup reached to a small bandolier of grenades and pulled one of the X-04 flashbangs, throwing it hard through the door against the opposing wall. A second later, a dull pop sounded. Brandy and Jessup continued their run, but now both had slung their rifles, both had blades out. Following the skeleton map on his HUD, Brandy led the way through the next door to find the hallway empty. He didn't mind that state of affairs at all. A dull klaxon began to sound throughout the crippled ship, and neither Brandy nor Jessup needed to be told twice that the Vral were now more than aware they had been boarded. Brandy turned down a corridor, instinctively lashing out and taking the head off of Vral that had been moving towards him. "Breaching bridge," he said into his microphone, hearing the tone of acknowledgement from Control as he saw the large bay doors that marked the command and control center of the Vral vessel they intended to take. He sheathed the blade as he came to a stop beside the bay door, out of range of the motion sensor that would open it automatically. Jessup was right behind him, freeing a hand of his own. They both reached up, yanking X-04 grenades off their pins banded to their armor. Brandy and Jessup looked at each other and nodded. As Brandy kicked out his foot to trigger the motion sensor, the door slid open. A torrent of laser fire erupted from the doorway, painting the floor and wall beyond. Brandy snapped his arm around, exposing only his hand as he threw the flashbang around the corner. Jessup's own flashbang flew past Brandy towards the other side of the room. They both immediately pulled a second grenade, even as the first detonated in the room beyond. Almost instantly, the weapon fire stopped, and wails of chittering echoed into the hallway. They threw the second set of flashbangs into the door. As the second pair of dull crunches sounded, Brandy and Jessup breached the bridge. The bridge was arrayed like a bowl, stations arranged orbiting a center divot in the deck where the captain would stand. None of the Vral in the room were standing. While flashbangs disoriented humans, essentially stunning them into stupefaction, the same flashbangs had even more pronounced effects on the Vral. Most of them were simply laid out on the ground, completely insensate, and screaming incoherently in their chittering tones. Brandy and Jessup had entered expecting at least one of them to have donned protection, perhaps even a war suit, but their boarding had caught the Vral completely by surprise. Jessup turned to the door, tapping the control panel and closing, then locking it. Brandy had already begun moving from station to station. Jessup joined him as they quickly and methodically dispatched the crew. Brandy turned and moved down into the captain's pit, coming to the Vral that had commanded the ship. "Attempting to access," Jessup said, stepping to one of the panels even as Brandy reached the side of the Vral commander. Brandy watched dispassionately as the Vral's body curled and spasmed on the ground. Without replying to Jessup, Brandy was already securing the commander. He flipped the commander over on its back, yanking its limbs together and zip-tying them together. "Control. Commander secured alive. Bridge secured," Brandy said, and he glanced over to Jessup. Jessup looked over to him and grinned, his teeth showing through the dark tint of the armored glass of his helmet. A tone of acknowledgement came into his helmet. Brandy moved to the panels just as Jessup was moving. "Anything yet?" he asked, letting his suit's speakers carry his voice. Jessup moved to another panel. "Nope, wiped," he said. Brandy brought the panel to life and was already moving on, cursing silently under his breath. Several times, teams like his had breached the bridge of a Vral ship only to find what they were finding now: wiped computer cores, dead panels. Brandy continued to move panel to panel, as did Jessup moving up the bowl. Brandy heard Jessup muttering as he went, his voice carrying because of the speakers in his suit. Brandy glanced up at the other man, then continued with his work. "Doesn't make any sense. We still know nothing about these bastards. Nothing," Jessup said as he was working on the last panel on the row he was on, "aside from the fact they melt their cores down really well." Brandy smirked behind the tinted glass of his helmet as Jessup balled up a fist. Jessup moved up a row, then started work on another panel. I'm beginning to think the only thing they exist for is to piss off the universe. Brandy couldn't argue with that, and Jessup stopped his grumbling, continuing to check the panels. Control, sweep 2 is down. I repeat, sweep 2 is down. Brandy stopped in his checks and looked up, the voice of Taub in his ear from possibly the same location he had called for sweepers to come in. He hadn't heard a call for sweepers from anywhere else. That's Vlad, Jessup said, his voice flat, having paused himself to listen in. Confirm. A woman's voice hit Brandy's ear, and Jessup began walking across the bowl towards him. Brandy settled his hands on the panel that he had paused midway through working. The woman's voice keyed back into his ear their control, and Brandy listened intently. Prep sweep 2 for extraction, sweep 3 and 4 en route. Jessup reached his side and put his hand on Brandy's shoulder. The silence in his ears now was deafening, and he knew he should be continuing on, checking the rest of the stations, but he couldn't move his feet right now. Brandy and Vlad were close. They had gone through basic together, they had gone through advanced infantry, as well as weapons and tactics, hell, all of their advanced training schools. When orders had come through, they had both been delighted to have twin assignments to the 17th Breacher Corps ghouls. Vlad had met Brandy's family, his mother, his father, even his ice queen of a sister who was serving as a drone cutter pilot. Vlad was his friend, the brother that he had never had, and now Vlad was down, somewhere on this hellhole of a ship, unable to even communicate that he was injured. Jessup stood by him, saying nothing, and Brandy's eyes were focused on something far in the distance, something he couldn't even see right now. Suddenly, like his mind was pulling itself from mud, he forced himself to continue working. Jessup stayed by his side. There was nothing he could do for Vlad right now, nothing at all, and he had work in front of him that needed to be finished. Jessup went back to the stations he was working through. Brandy finished the sweep of the panels on his side. Nothing as was usual. He walked down the bowl shape of the Vral bridge, standing next to the Vral commander, who was now very much aware and awake, not struggling as it lay on the floor of the carnal house that was the bridge of its ship. He ignored it, placing his hands on the hilts of the twin swords at his sides. Jessup continued his work, a little slower than Brandy was. But then again, Jessup was newer than Brandy himself was to this sort of thing. Brandy had already served for nearly 8 years and had done the teardown from the 6th Orion War alongside Vlad. Brandy grunted and pulled up his arm, opening one of the armor plates to reveal the communications controls for his suit. He set up a private channel to Control. Control BT-1, status of sweep 2? He asked, and he heard 2 clicks in response. He was being transferred to another operator. Brandy felt his entire body tensing up. He didn't know if being transferred was a good or a bad sign. Bridge Team 1, this is secondary. Sweep 2 is stable. Sweep 1 is prepping him for extraction. He took an indirect hit by a plasma round to his left shoulder. His suit took the majority, but he's going to be in the burn unit. Brandy breathed out and then nodded once to himself. Thank you, secondary. He heard a tone in response, then he set himself back to team communications. Vlad was alive, that was good enough. The void will take you. He heard the chittering sound translated, and he slowly looked towards the prone form of the commander. Brandy turned and walked over and purposefully stepped over the Vral. He then knelt down next to the figure. You will not survive. We will bathe in your ashes. When? Brandy said, a dark bit of amusement in his tone. Come on. When? Daylight's wasting. The void will take you, the Vral repeated, then went silent again as Brandy stood up and stepped over the commander once more. Jessup was coming down to meet with him in the center of the bowl. Good news, Vlad's gonna make it, Brandy told him. He'll be in the burn unit for a bit. Don't know where he got hit, but the suit saved him. Good. What's the word from the local moral officer? Jessup said, motioning to the Vral, who was laying again in silence. Same as normal. We're gonna die. Void's gonna take us. Ashes, dancing on my grave. Brandy shrugged. You know, what they normally say, that friendly little conversation. Brandy could actually feel Jessup's eyes rolling. Control bridge team secured and detailed, Jessup said, and they both heard the click of acknowledgement. Another 2 hours, maybe? Jessup asked, and Brandy nodded. Welp, 2 today, that makes 6 boardings for me. How many for you? 40, Brandy replied, and Jessup whistled low. And that's just these types. I was actually put on a team as a standby sweep for a battleship or two, but mostly light cruisers. No corvettes or destroyers, though. They normally just send the heavies to take those. The cruisers, though? Heavy cruisers? Carriers? I've done a few of those, too, but mostly this. Jessup leaned against the back of one of the panels that he had checked. What kind of team do they send to a carrier? He asked, and Brandy laughed. Put it to you like this. They send units of Chua war machines and what's called a kill team. They don't even bother sweeping like we do with these ships. They just punch holes in every room and open them to vacuum. And the kill teams go in to make sure none of them got into a warsuit. Brandy tapped his chest. We barely do anything. They just turn the entire ship into Swiss cheese, then call us in to check panels. Kill teams are just different, but it's an experience. You don't get to really do much, though. Go in, stay behind the kill team, and check you elect a... Brandy stopped talking, and both of them listened as a tone sounded from control. Then they heard her speak. All objectives secured. Stand by in location. Prepare for tow and extraction. The two of them reached out and grabbed hold of a panel, and Brandy looked over at Jessup. Well, quicker than I thought. Just as he was finishing that sentence, the entire hull seemed to shake, and he felt a small surge of negative G-force before his body adjusted. A lot quicker. What do you think they'll get out of this? Jessup asked as he let go of the panel. Oh, hell, Brandy said, motioning to the ship they were in. 3 destroyers easy, maybe a corvette added in, couple of fighters. Ever seen the reprocessors? Jessup shrugged at the question, and Brandy pointed at him. When we get back, if you have some downtime, just ask to watch. It's some impressive shit. I watched one of those crews break down a corvette in 2 hours. Jessup raised his eyebrow, and Brandy held up 2 fingers. 2. No shit. Something like this is going to take them maybe a day, probably less than that. It's absolute magic. I was raised on the Los Angeles flats, Jessup said, and it was Brandy's turn to raise an eyebrow. You know, where they had one of the landfills. They said they used a reprocessor for that, too. Yeah, the Chua know how to make the most out of everything. Did you know there used to be a floating island of plastic in the Pacific Ocean? Brandy placed his hands on the hilts of his blades as Jessup shook his head no. Yeah, when the Chua got set up, first thing they did was clean up all of that. Tons of plastic, centuries of fuck-ups, and they fixed it in barely a month. Earth was trashy, real trashy. Now we just reprocess everything. I never looked into how that works, Jessup said, then laughed when Brandy raised his fingers and wiggled them in the air. PFM? Yep, pure fucking magic. At least that's how it looks to me. Brandy sighed. Then he motioned to the panels. We had the technology centuries ago, but we just never refined it like the Chua did. I asked how it worked, and I felt like I was an ape. They felt the same way about our computers, the way we feel about their reprocessors, though. So I guess it evens out. What do you mean? Brandy glanced over at him and smirked. Then he motioned to his suit's right chest pauldron, where his suit's electronic suite for his HUD was kept. This here has more processing power than the Chua had on one of their battleships. They just didn't focus on it like we did. The concept of a microprocessor blew their minds. We know how to store 100 terabytes on a fingernail. They know how to break down a landfill into bars of material. Jessup leaned back against the panel again and grunted. Seriously, ask to watch what they do to this thing. They're going to slice it up, put the pieces into the reprocessors, and by tomorrow it's going to be raw materials. No waste, it's crazy. Brandy turned his head back to the Vral laying on the floor, hearing it muttering to itself. He narrowed his eyes for a few moments, listening to the sound of the clicking, then he looked back to Jessup. Wish that thing would just shut the hell up. A moment later, he said a bit louder, We get it, asshole. The void is coming. It's going to take us. Ashes, death, suffering. We get it. Shut the hell up. He pushed himself off the panel and walked to the edge of the bridge nearer to the door. Non-stop with them? Jessup gestured to the commander with his head. What are we doing with him? Well, he'll get to tell an interrogation team about the void. Bet he's got a hard-on for that. Brandy replied, then paused and glanced at the upper right of his HUD, seeing a few green dots moving in their direction. Then they'll just toss his ass out of an airlock. Ready to go? Yep. Jessup pushed up from the panel he was leaning on and joined Brandy near the door and waited as they both watched the dots approaching the door. Brandy reached over and toggled the lock, and the door slid open. 4 humans in construction harnesses with atmospheric suits rated for vacuum were just coming to a stop. Behind them, Brandy could already see the 2 other members of the team coming to relieve them. "Is that vodka?" one of them said, a hard feminine voice coming from one of the suits. Brandy's eyebrow perked up, and so did Jessup's entire body. Both of them knew Janet Shippen's voice. Janet was what Brandy's mother would call a feral tomboy. Short, muscled, her brown hair cut in a pixie cut, who felt more at home covered in engine fluid than anything else. She was also what his father would call an absolute knockout. Jessup had met her 3 times and was in love. Brandy's relationship with Janet was a private affair, but Jessup wouldn't find out about it. No sense in breaking his heart after all. Not to mention that Brandy looked at Jessup as a friend. "How the hell are you, shipwreck?" Brandy said with a smirk. "I got you a nice one here. I even got you a local to keep you company. Ask him about the void. He'll tell you all you want to hear." The 2 figures in the back, clad in all black with no identifying markers, looked to Brandy, who simply pointed towards the Vral commander laying on the floor. "By the way, I ran into Vlad before I came over here," she said, coming closer to the 2 ghouls. "They got him out of his suit before they sent us over. He's got an ass of a burn on his shoulder, but he said he's going to be a bitch about it, so they'll give you fuckers some downtime." Brandy smiled, knowing if Vlad was joking around, he was more than okay. Janet motioned to the bridge. "Lot of nothing?" she asked, and both of the ghouls nodded. "Figures, fuckers." All 3 of them watched for a moment as the 2 black-clad humans knelt over the Vral commander. "All right, I've got to prep this bitch for breakdown, then I'm done for the day. Salvagers are just putting most of the wrecks in orbit." Jessup glanced to Brandy before speaking. "Think they want to move again soon?" "Bet your ass." Janet reached for her side and pulled out a data pad. "Way I see it, we're just topping off right now, waiting for some of the boats out there to get their shit together. Then they are going to move us out. Speaking of moving out, bounce your asses, I've got shit to do so I can get off once we pull back into Antares." "Call us a cab?" Brandy asked, using the slang term for the shuttle that had delivered Janet's team and would take his own back to Antares. "Yep, we made entrance right next to where you did." Janet started moving into the bridge towards a grouping of panels hard-mounted to the wall. She stopped and glanced back at Brandy. "It's been a hell of a day, almost 18 hours. I'm going to get a stiff drink in my quarters." "You do that. I'm going to check on Vlad and get him settled in before I do anything else," Brandy said, and she turned and went to the panel. Brandy was glad for the tint of his helmet's visor, or else his smirk would need explaining to Jessup, who was none the wiser. Once he went through Debrief and turned over his gear, he already knew what he was going to be doing. Straight to Engineering Deck C, where Janet would be waiting. Kukat was miserable, or at least was acting like she was. Vicky was rigidly standing at attention, as was Jess, standing stock still beside Kukat's bed. The loud exclamation that had brought them to their feet of, "What the chicken fried fuck?" had come from the man standing in front of them. Vicky wanted to crawl into a hole and die. Jess was trying to keep herself from laughing. Kukat reached out a 3-fingered hand towards the man wearing a captain's eagle on his flight jumper, a hand that had 2 small bow tie stickers on it. "Torture. Help," Kukat said, as weak as a newborn kitten, and Jess's breath escaped her in a buzzing of her lips from someone desperately attempting to keep in her laughter. The small sheet containing bow ties, smiley faces, stars, and other cartoonish stickers fell from her hand that was clenched firmly at her side. Kukat was wearing half of them. Captain Yang stared in an expression of one who is seeing something for the first time when they had believed they had seen it all. "Help," Kukat said again, holding out her other arm, which had a line of stars stuck to it all the way down to the back of her hand. Yang slowly brought his fingers up to squeeze the bridge of his nose, and then he turned on his heel and faced away from the trio. Vicky just wanted to die. The captain of the cruiser had visited them a few times in the past 3 days since they had been brought on board by the Barrowmore. Kukat had been immediately rushed to start receiving medical care, Victoria Brandy and Jessica Anders had been by her side from the second they were allowed back, barring short periods where either woman needed to file their reports. The problem was, every time Captain Yang had come back to visit them, it was always at the most inopportune time. The first time he had walked into Jess cuddling the small Chua in a bed that was almost a meter too small for her. The second time, Vicky had taped Jess's hands and feet to her chair. The third time, Jess had been singing a nursery rhyme to Kukat. Each time Yang had walked in, Vicky had felt like crawling in a hole. Jess had desperately tried not to laugh, and Kukat had acted like a prisoner of war. Vicky was getting the feeling the captain was enjoying these trips down to see her and her crew. "Can someone explain to me why the 3 pilots that I'm supposed to award the Terran Star to are acting like toddlers in my medbay?" he said. Then he turned back to face them. Vicky didn't want to die anymore. Jess stopped laughing. Kukat's hands fell to the heated blanket that covered her. All 3 of them were to be awarded the highest honor in the Terran fleet. Now it was the captain's turn to laugh as he stepped forward and grabbed Vicky's hand, which almost knocked her off balance as he began vigorously shaking it. "Congratulations." Vicky stared at him for a few long moments, trying to parse through the entire scenario in her head. None of them had paid much attention to news outside of the medbay. Vicky had barely even been back on board the Thumper aside from downloading nav data to be included in her flight logs. "Captain," she said, sounding to even her own ears a bit disjointed, "what did we find out there?" "First off, at ease," Yang said. Then he smirked as Jess began to self-consciously pluck the stickers off of Kukat, her eyes on him. He turned his attention to her. "Your flight records and the reserve drone data is being sent back to Earth to be implemented into training." His attention turned to all of them in turn. "You really don't know, do you?" All 3 shook their heads and Vicky took a step back to stand side by side with her crew. "We haven't been paying much attention to what's been coming in," Vicky said, and she placed her hand on Kukat's medical bed. Yang nodded, understanding. This crew was a very tight group, and he could see that even from the small amount of time he had been around them. "You scouted out the entire Vral fleet. They were evacuating. I don't think they expected us to move as fast as we did on them, so when we jumped into the system, they were barely organized into battle lines." Yang interlocked his fingers in front of his belt. "Because of what you got on those scans, we knew exactly what we were jumping into. We knew exactly what we would do the moment we landed and—" He paused for a moment, letting his words stand out. "We eradicated their entire fleet." Vicky looked to Jess. Jess's mouth hung slightly open. "I knew it was a fleet," Jess said after a moment. When she had been asked by Vicky a few hours after they had gotten Kukat settled, Jess had insisted she had been trying to evade fire from point defense and laser batteries from at least 12 ships. What she didn't know, and what would be reflected on the citation for the award she was yet to receive, was that she had been evading around 30 individual vessels' weapons fire. "Not a fleet," Yang said, and Jess looked back at him. "It was the fleet." Jess looked at him in confusion for a few seconds, as did Vicky. "Shit," Kukat chirped, and all 3 humans looked down at the small, sticker-covered Chua. Kukat's mouth hung open slightly. Jess looked up to Vicky and both seemed to realize what was said at the same time. Jess's hand shot to her mouth, covering it, her eyes wide as Vicky stepped back to lean against the wall. Yang waited a few moments, then stepped forward. "Well, I hope you 3 are ready," he said as he crossed his arms over his chest. "Drone cutters are supposed to cut and run the second they get in trouble. You 3, he motioned to them with a wave of his hand. "You stuck around, and because you did, you handed us everything we needed to go after them." Jess's hand came down on Kukat's small shoulder, and one of the smiley face stickers peeled off as Kukat wrapped her hand around Jess's pointer finger. Vicky slowly pressed her back against the wall and started sliding down it. "Basically, to be blunt, now that this is broken, every news feed in the Terran front wants pictures of you, details on your status." He motioned to Kukat. "And to be honest, I've had to keep them from taking over the ship to get to you." Jess and Vicky exchanged a glance and then looked back to Yang. Kukat had not looked away from him even for a moment. Yang shrugged his shoulders and turned to the display panel on the wall and activated it. He tapped the panel for a few moments, then the sounds of cheering came through. On the display was a live news feed, and they could hear the reporter's voice barely above the cacophony of the crowd around her. Oh. Action. The news of the destruction of the fleet has sparked widespread celebrations of joy. The foot of the enemy that we have all felt over us has been cut off. Thermopylae Station, for the first time in nearly a century, is standing down from Condition 1 to Condition 3. The reporter was almost shouting, and Vicky breathed out, even as she heard a low tone from Kukat and a sob coming from Jess. Yang had his back turned to them, watching, and without saying another word, he turned and walked out. Once Condition 3 was set at Thermopylae, the information began to pour in from the Zizma system as well as the planet Zvitia located there. Fleet Marshal Simmons of the Antares battle fleet will be continuing to press into former SciFi accordance territory once consolidation is completed. The reporter paused. The moment she had said Antares, a chant had begun, and it was overwhelming. The thunder of uncountable human voices yelling, "We're still here," drowned her out entirely. The reporter eventually just held up her hands helplessly as the chant overwhelmed the microphone's input threshold, turning the people's chanting into a dull roar. The feed cut over to an image of a man behind a news desk, the ticker at the bottom of the screen citing off ship names. Again, if you're just joining us, the Vral have been soundly beaten in the Zizma system. The enemy's losses have been stated as total. Fleet Marshal Simmons, commander of the Antares battle group, will be holding a press conference at a later date to discuss the events of today, but has released a few names to us as well as their roles within the conflict. Jess, Vicky's, and Kukat's individual service portraits slowly appeared on the screen while the reporter spoke. "Holy shit," Jess whispered. "That's us." Vicky stared at the screen even as Kukat squeezed Jess's finger. Lieutenant Victoria Brandy, Drone Operator 2nd Class Jessica Anders, and Drone Operator 3rd Class Kukat were conducting a routine drone sweep of the Zizma system when they sighted the Vral. The three managed to gain enough intelligence to warrant the immediate redeployment of the Antares battle group, which had been in rescue and recovery efforts above the Chua homeworld. Vicky just stared at the man as he continued talking on the display. From the feeds that we have managed to confirm, the crew of the scout ship stayed while exposed and under threat and under fire until such time as the information was confirmed transmitted. All three of the scout's crew made it back safely, although Drone Operator 3rd Class Kukat was reported as needing medical attention, the reasons of which are unknown, but it is reported that she is in stable condition. Their portraits fell away from the screen as another image came up, of a Chua in a captain's uniform came up, grayed out. Vicky just stared at the screen. Jess breathed out a breath that she didn't even know she had been holding. Kukat leaned back into her pillow. "We famous," Kukat chirped. The news reporter was still speaking, something about a battleship that had engaged the Vral, some new story of heroism. The three of them sat in silence. Vicky wanted to look to Kukat and Jess, but both of them were quiet. Suddenly, Vicky and Kukat flinched as Jess erupted out of her seat. "Yeah, that's right. What do you think now, Rick?" Jess said her ex-boyfriend's name with vitriol. "Who's not photogenic now, huh? Galaxy-wide, baby." She whooped, and Kukat stared up at her in amazement as Vicky buried her head in her hands and laughed. "You problem," Kukat chirped low. "I told you you suck at picking men, Kukat," Jess proclaimed. "You still suck, Rick."